Greetings and welcome to the third episode of Australia-China Media Watch. We're looking at articles published between the 29th of November, that's a Monday, all the way through to Sunday, the 5th of December. The Global Times had 30 instances of Australia appearing in its headlines or content. Sky News Australia, through this week, had 13 instances. Let's begin by unpacking the Global Times. First up, 29th of November, Monday, author Zhang Hui, Wang Wenwen, and Fan Wei. Headline reads, China to further help Africa's vaccination drive, shielding continent from Omicron. This article relates to how the Omicron variant has already been found in Australia. Moving along to the next headline, this was originally published by the AFP in the Global Times column Eye on the World. Headline reads, Japan, latest to slam borders shut. We'll head into the article for a bit more of a further unpacking. Gonna make use of the search function Australia. It looks like Australia appears once in the article. The paragraph reads, the variant is also throwing a tentative opening up into doubt in Australia, where the government is now reconsidering plans to relax border restrictions in just 2 days. But with 3 Omicron cases confirmed in people flying into Australia from Southern Africa, Prime Minister Scott Morrison appeared reluctant to reimpose the kinds of strict lockdowns seen earlier in 2020. We don't just need to live alongside COVID-19, we need to learn to live alongside the variants as well, unquote, he said in a statement. We'll move along to the next headline. Also published on Monday the 29th of November, authored by the Global Times staff reporters in the column, the 2022 Beijing Olympics. Boycott Beijing Winter Olympics. China never plans to invite these politicians, source says. Heading into the article itself for a bit more unpacking. And once more, use of the keyword Australia. Looks like appears somewhere in the middle of the article, and the paragraph reads, according to data from the Beijing Organizing Committee for the 2022 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games as of November 2017, it had received more than 14,000 applications for registration from countries including the US, Australia, and European nations. The next mention was in a further paragraph that reads, Australian athletes cherish the opportunity to compete in the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, said Jeff Lipshut, Chief de Mission, I'm not sure if I'm getting the pronunciation of that correct, for the Australian Olympic team, the Xinhua news agency reported on November 18th. Our athletes, quote, traveled last season in very difficult circumstances around the world during COVID-19 without vaccine then, so they had to be very health conscious, but all of them took it very seriously because they wanted to qualify to go to Beijing, unquote, said a former aerial skiing coach who has been to 7 Olympics since 1994. That concludes the mentions of Australia's in this article. Boycott Winter Olympics. China never plans to invite these US politicians. We'll move along to the article entitled Strict Control Vaccine Research Give China the Edge on Omicron. This was published in the diplomacy column by the authors Zhang Hui and Cui Fan Di. Heading into the article to have a closer look. Australia is mentioned once in the article. This is 5 or 6 paragraphs down. As of Tuesday, at least 14 countries and regions, including Spain, Germany, and Australia, have detected the variant. No other mentions in this article. Published on November the 30th, authored by the Global Times in its editorial column. Headline reads, China's counter-deterrence best response to US threats from second island chain, by the Global Times editorial. This deserves further unpacking. We're going to head in there. I'm going to look at mentions of Australia. But before we do so, we'll have a close look at the opening paragraph. The US Department of Defense released on Tuesday an unclassified version of the 2021 Global Posture Review, known as the GPR, and the report plans to improve airfields in Guam and Australia to counter, quote, China's military buildup and more assertive use of power, unquote, according to a report by the Wall Street Journal, which also confirmed that GPR contains no major reshuffling of forces. The GPR highlights the Indo-Pacific region as a priority area for the US military and improving airfield construction in Guam and Australia, including adding more facilities to store fuel and ammunition, could provide reinforcements of warplanes and military personnel in a short time. The US is building a deterrent against China. It's worth mentioning that the unclassified part of the GPR focuses on Guam and Australia. Both are strategic points in the second island chain. In the last 2 years, the US has mentioned less about the construction of strong points in the first island chain. This is not only because the first island chain is already well built, but also because there is speculation that the US no longer counts on the first island chain. Further mentions, US allies in the Asia-Pacific region are taking the initiative to strengthen their ties with the US. They've also shown an eagerness to support US forces in their operations against the PLA someday in the future, and they feel that strengthening their alliance with the US would only increase their influence as a bargaining chip. We should make them aware by doing so they actually face more risks. As the saying goes, no pain, no gain. A following paragraph reads, Australia is eager to follow the US. This is typical of Canberra. It is also extremely reckless and almost arrogant in terms of strategy. China needs to make clear to Australia through capacity build-up and leaks of information. If Australia is ready to follow the US and get involved in a war in the Taiwan Straits, as well as to use US bases in Australia as a springboard for their involvement in the war, then it is putting its own national security at stake. Just going to double check if there are any further mentions of Australia in the article. No further mentions detected. We'll move on. And that was from the headline, China's counter-deterrence best response to US threats from second island chain. The next article was published on November 30th by the Global Times staff reporters in the business focus column. Headline reads, Freight costs between China, US likely to hit new high amid Omicron breakout. Australia is mentioned over here because of the existence of the Omicron variant on its shores. The next article is published on the 30th of November too, by the author Liu Xuanzun in the military column. US Global Posture Review targets China, exposes weakness in first island chain. The headline reads, heading into the article for a closer unpacking, and looks like Australia has been mentioned. In the opening paragraph, US President Joe Biden recently accepted recommendations from the Pentagon in the Global Posture Review to prioritize the Indo-Pacific region with a particular focus on China through military infrastructure build-ups in Australia and the Pacific Islands, US media reported on Tuesday. A further mention comes in the paragraph that reads, to counter China, the review directed the Pentagon to enhance quote-unquote infrastructure in Guam and Australia, and to prioritize, quote, military construction across the Pacific Islands, unquote, the official said, as well as to, quote, seek greater regional access for military partnership activities. A further mention of Australia is found in the paragraph that reads, Explaining the details of the Pentagon's plan in Guam, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, Collins said that the new rotational fighter and bomber aircraft deployments, ground forces training, and increased logistics operation will be held in Australia, and a range of infrastructure improvements will be done in Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and Australia. The number of troops and equipment in other areas of the world will also be reduced to enable improved war fighting readiness and increased activities in the Indo-Pacific. By focusing on Guam, Australia, and the Pacific Islands, the US is admitting that China has become powerful enough to break the first island chain, so it is now stepping back to the second island chain, she said. In the following paragraph, by developing large warships, including aircraft carriers, and enhancing long-range capabilities for warplanes, the PLA can expand its perimeter and create greater defense depth, she said, noticing that the PLA also has long-range strike capabilities, including the DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which can hit Guam and Australia. No further mentions of Australia in this article. The headline, of course, US global posture reviews targets China, exposes weakness in the first island chain. We'll move along to the next paper or article published in the Global Times. This was originally from Reuters in the column World Focus. Headline reads, "A new republic is born, Barbados." Australia is mentioned over here with a reference to Queen Elizabeth, who's still queen of 15 other realms, including the UK, Australia, Canada, and Jamaica. We'll move along to a next article entitled Seventh Heaven. Barcelona and Spain teammate Jennifer Hermoso was second, and Sam Kerr of Chelsea and Australia becoming. I believe this article relates to the game of soccer or football. Originally published from the AFP in the column Miscellany. So this paper, or this article rather, looks at the football awards and mention of Australia. I believe comes with Sam Kerr. There we go. So yeah, Sam Kerr of Chelsea and Australia coming in third. No other mentions of Australia in this article. This came out also on the 30th of November. The headline reads, Dutton's saber-rattling and election tactic to strike fear of China amongst swing voters. Authored by Bruce Hay. Column is from the Asian Review. We'll head into the article for a closer unpacking. The opening paragraph reads, speaking at the National Press Club in Canberra on November 26th, Australian Defence Minister Peter Dutton said Australia would join the US to quote-unquote defend Taiwan if the Chinese mainland attacked the island. I'm going to make use of the search term. So multiple mentions over here. In the next paragraph, this indeed shows that the reactionary ruling Liberal National Party has learned nothing over the past 50 years. Sharing in the American failures of Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan apparently has not registered on Australian policymakers, or perhaps they are tactically acknowledging that they do not make policies. Wherever the US goes, Australia will follow without thought or consideration. Dutton, a none-too-bright minister in an incredibly pedestrian and what many see as a corrupt government, appears to have been briefed by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the ASPI, that is partially funded by US arms manufacturers. The remainder of its funding comes from the US Embassy and the Australian government, so it's not anything but independent. The next article was published in the Diplomacy column, 30th of November. Headline reads, China urges US, UK, Australia to correct wrong decision over nuclear submarine deal. The next headline was published, the next article rather was published on the 1st of December by the author Ji Yuqiao in the column Top China News. Headline reads, Celebrities' promotion of vegetarian lifestyle meets with criticism and mockery online. Heading into the article itself for a closer unpacking, opening paragraph reads, some Chinese entertainers' promotion of people adopting a vegetarian lifestyle on social media recently met with widespread criticism and mockery online, as many netizens claim such a lifestyle is not healthy for the public, and they decried the celebrities' blind worship of the West. Mention of Australia appears once, and it looks like it's referring to data about meat consumption, and the paragraph reads, China's per capita meat consumption is only 44 kilograms, much lower than the 101 kilograms in the US and 89.3 kilograms in Australia. For further context, the paragraph that came before it, you have Shen Yi, a deputy director at the Fudan University Cyberspace Research Center, told the Global Times on Wednesday that Star's calls for a vegetarian lifestyle represents a blind worship of Western values and views. They were just deluded by some heresies. Some Western countries do not want to give up their luxurious lifestyles, driving cars with large engines and eating beef, but they ask developing countries to change to let them maintain their lifestyles, Shen said. We'll move along to the next article. This one was published by the author Mu Lu in the column Viewpoints. Headline reads, Why is Little England abandoning Big Britain? Heading into the article for a closer unpacking, and Australia is mentioned once. And the paragraph reads, on the one hand, Britain wants to avoid the burden of its bloody colonial history, while on the other, it also wants to make full use of the cultural influence and identity it had brought to its colonies during the colonial era. After Brexit, some in the UK began to discuss revitalising the historical resources of the Commonwealth. However, Britain hasn't the strength to comprehensively assist all of those realms, and it won't be necessary for Britain either. London may strive to keep Australia and Canada around, but it won't spend much time on countries like Barbados, Tsui noted. No further mentions of Australia. And we move along to the next article, also published on the 1st of December. Headline reads, China's Kunlun and Taishan meteorological stations put into operation in the Antarctic. So China becoming the third country following Australia and the US to conduct scientific operations in Antarctica, I believe. But just to verify things a little, we'll head into the article itself for a closer unpacking. So China's Kunlun station and Taishan station in the Antarctic were officially put into operation on Wednesday. They obtained long-term and continuous conventional meteorological observation data to effectively enhance China's forecasting capability for polar weather. And Australia appears once. And just to clarify, I may have made a mistake in my earlier comment. In 2018, China became the third country following Australia and the US to conduct continuous automatic meteorological operations in the ultra-low temperatures of the Antarctic, according to the CMA. No other mentions of Australia in that article. We move along to another piece that was published on the 1st of December. The headline reads, Crocodile Dundee actor Dailai Fingu passes away. I do apologize if I got the pronunciation wrong. Originally published by the AFP. So, Indigenous Australian actor who mesmerized audiences in his breakout movie Walkabout and was hailed as one of the country's greatest artists has died at the age of 68, 4 years after being diagnosed with lung cancer. Mentions of Australia can be found a number of times in the second paragraph, providing context into where he was raised in Australia's Northern Territories. Having received the Order of Australia, the actor and Aboriginal dancer spent his final years in Murray Bridge, south of South Australia, because of ill health. It's with deep sadness that I share with the people of South Australia the passing of an iconic, once-in-a-generation artist who shaped us the history of Australian film and Aboriginal representation on the screen. The next article is published in the column Asian Review on the 1st of December. US competitors picking up Australia's lost sales in China frustrates Aussie producers. Heading into the article for a close unpacking. Opening paragraph reads, according to a recent report by the Australia-China Relations Institute of the University of Technology, Sydney, the value of 12 Australian exports to China affected by the China-Australia dispute fell by $17.3 billion in the first 9 months of this year compared with the 2019 figures. During the same period, the value of US exports of the same commodities increased by $6.3 billion. Australia is serving as an anti-China vanguard for the US, but Washington has become the biggest beneficiary of the China-Australia dispute. Why has Australia chosen this path? Will the Morrison government adjust its China policy? Global Times reporters Yu Jincui and Wang Wenwen interviewed James Lawrenson, director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, via email. The opening question reads, in your opinion, how will the Australian business community view these figures? What impact will they have on Australia's future diplomacy with US and China? The response by Lawrenson reads, the figures won't surprise business leaders in the slightest. Indeed, they've been foreshadowing this as an entirely predictable outcome for more than a year, as have academics like myself. But this is not to say that business leaders will lobby the Australian government to make substantive changes to its foreign policy. They won't. What they're wanting is an honest assessment by Canberra of the costs and recognition by the government of who is bearing these costs. Australian businesses and Australian businesses alone. And for Canberra to think harder about how they might be better supported. For Australian producers watching American competitors pick up their lost sales in China, hearing the Morrison administration repeat ad nauseum the line that the US stands quote-unquote shoulder to shoulder with Australia is a frustrating experience. It must also be said that many Australian businesses are very disappointed by Beijing. After investing years of goodwill and resources into building relationships with China, they found that these efforts were undone not by any mistakes they themselves made or because Chinese importers no longer wanted their goods, but rather by the political dispute between Beijing and Canberra. Sadly, this experience will linger in the minds of Australian businesses for a long time to come. And in my view, the Morrison administration's diplomatic approach towards China is locked in. Some reasonable public policy moves in the past, like banning foreign political donations and tightening up foreign interference laws, are now being overlaid with rhetoric and interventions that are firmly focused on domestic politics and amplifying threat perceptions of China amongst the general public. The good news is that this bold political strategy is fairly widely recognized. This isn't to say that China doesn't present genuine challenges to Australia's interests. Rather, the productive way to respond isn't the way being adopted. Meanwhile, there's little evidence of a course correction in Beijing either, making it easy for China hawks in Australia to claim they were right about China all along. As usual, it's individuals and businesses in Australia that are suffering from the political fallout. We'll keep moving along to the next article. This one was published in the column Eye on World. Headline reads, WHO warns against travel bans. Australia is mentioned over here as one of the countries where the variant has been detected. Also published on the 1st of December in the column Companies Stopping Transfers. Gonna head into the article for a close unpacking. So Chinese airlines halt transfer routes from Africa, other regions amid Omicron variant. And Australia's mentioned once. And the paragraph reads, on Monday, the Japanese government announced that it would prohibit foreigners from entering Japan from Tuesday. Australia originally planned to open its borders to international students and skilled immigrants from Wednesday, but it has now postponed reopening to December 15th. No other mentions of Australia in the article. The next headline was published. Next headline reads, Chinese embassy warns students to pay attention to safety as Australia postpones border reopening with rise of Omicron cases. The article was published by the author Xu Keyue in the column Coronavirus. Heading into the article for a closer unpacking. And the opening paragraph reads, as the reopening plan for Australia's border has been postponed 2 weeks to December 15th with the arrival of the Omicron variant, the Chinese embassy in Australia warned international students to be mindful of their well-being as health and safety risks in the country have increased significantly. On Monday, the Australian government decided to pause the next step to reopen the country to international skilled and student cohorts, as well as humanitarian, working holiday maker, and provisional family visa holders. International students who have been fully inoculated with Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, approved by Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, can enter the country from December 15th. The Chinese embassy on Tuesday published an article warning Chinese international students to wear a medical face mask, keep social distance, and avoid traveling on holiday in the country. The embassy advised international students to rationally choose the time and flight route to Australia. Students can continue to take online courses and other forms of study according to the regulations of the university, the embassy announced. We'll move along to the next article. This one was published on the 2nd of December in the diplomacy column. The headline reads, China's rare emergency meeting, a warning to Kishida government over Abe's influence in extreme right-wing thought and militarism. The opening paragraph reads, China's rare emergency meeting with the Japanese ambassador over erroneous remarks made by Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on the Taiwan question was powerful and necessary at a time when the shadow of Abe that went through the Yoshihide Suga cabinet is now reaching Fumio Kishida's administration, which aims to affect Kishida's policies with Abe's extreme right-wing thought and militarism, Chinese observers said on Thursday. Mentions of Australia, appears twice, and the paragraph reads, in October, China lodged stern representations with Australia over inappropriate comments made by former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott on the Taiwan question and his visit to the island of Taiwan. No further mentions of Australia in this article. Also published on the 2nd of December in the Observer column, the headline reads, Campbell appeases Australia as Washington steals Canberra's market share. The opening paragraph reads, to put Australia at ease is as the most loyal pawn of the US strategy towards China, some American politicians need to make hollow promises from time to time, trying to give Canberra placebos. But such so-called reassurances cannot hide one single and simple fact. The Australian government lacks real diplomatic autonomy to make choices in line with its own strategic interests. US Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell on Wednesday said that Australia will not lose quote-unquote sovereignty under the AUKUS deal. Quote, I fully understand how important sovereignty and independence is for Australia, so I don't want to leave any sense that somehow that would be lost, unquote. He claimed at an event hosted by the Lowy Institute. Again, Campbell targeted China by accusing the country of waging dramatic economic warfare against the US ally. But seriously, how much sovereignty is there for Australia to lose? Although Campbell called Australia a close ally and stressed that it's not merely an adjunct to Washington, Canberra has been closely following the US strategy and even completely turned to the US. It is much too obvious whether Australia is a close ally or an adjunct to the US. Under the AUKUS deal, the use of nuclear submarines technology is too sensitive for Australia to decide alone. Therefore, Australia will have to listen to the US in terms of its future strategy and tactics. It has become a pawn serving the US's Indo-Pacific strategy, according to Guo Chunmei, an expert on Australian studies with the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, told the Global Times. We'll move on to the next article. Originally published in Reuters in the column Americas, the headline reads, US reports first Omicron case, relating to how share market indices in Japan and Australia were weaker after the fallout from the Omicron variant. News hitting Wall Street. The next article is published in the Viewpoint column. No incentive for China to do so if Australia isn't willing to mend ties. Interesting choice of graphical illustrations over here. We've got some kind of Venn diagram with a Aussie kangaroo to the left, and you've got a Chinese panda to the right. Could they find some common ground? The opening paragraph reads, James Lawrenson, director of the Australian-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, said in an interview with Global Times that many Australian businesses are very disappointed by Beijing. So it looks like they're bringing to life this article yet again with an opinion piece. And I'll move on. As the many exports to China suffered an evident drop because of the China-Australia dispute. Yes, many Australian businesses are disappointed, but their disappointment is not merely towards China. They must be clearly aware that the root cause of the deterioration of China-Australian relations does not lie in China, but lies in the Morrison administration, which has repeatedly trodden on China's red line on issues concerning China's core interests. It's believed they may have more dissatisfaction towards their own government. Lawrenson said the Morrison government's diplomatic approach towards China is locked in. Meanwhile, there is little evidence of a course correction in Beijing either. What kind of course correction does Australia want to see? First, the country hopes China changes its policy towards Australia and not to react violently, against its provocations. Canberra also wants Beijing to understand Australia's following the US suit in strategic deployment, even though these moves are to contain China. However, the fact is that Australia's constant provocations on China are the root cause of the deterioration of China-Australian ties, and China's responses have just been a rational reaction to Australia's provocations. Second, Canberra may also want Beijing to change its manner on foreign policy. Australia has constantly said China's diplomacy has become increasingly assertive. In fact, China's hardline stance is mainly shown on issues that concern its core interests, such as the Taiwan question. And China is reluctant to have frictions with Australia, the US, as well as its allies, as long as they do not interfere with China's internal affairs and undermines China's interests. We'll move along to the next article. Published on the 3rd of December by the author Tom Foley in the column Viewpoint. The headline of this article reads, "Call to boycott Olympics through Xinjiang narrative is US concerted propaganda campaign." Heading into the article to further unpack Australia's role in this. Opening paragraph reads, "As the Winter Olympics in Beijing approaches early next year, some forces are content to stir up trouble. It has been reported that the Biden administration has already made a de facto decision to pursue a diplomatic boycott of the event in response to allegations made regarding China's policies in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Whilst athletes would be allowed to participate, US government officials or representatives would be barred from the event. States overtly loyal to Washington, including the United Kingdom and Australia, have contemplated similar moves. Mentions of Australia came up once in the opening paragraph, and there are no further mentions. The next article's headline reads, "Biden's Global Posture Review long on rhetoric, but short on substance." This was authored by Scott Ritter in the Viewpoint column. Opening paragraph reads, "The Biden administration has announced it's completed its Global Posture Review, a broad brush assessment of how the US military is deployed outside the United States. The GPR is a bureaucratic exercise whose sole function is to inform the draft of the next iteration of the National Defense Strategy, which is to be published later on this month." Mentions of Australia appear twice, and the paragraph reads, "So far, only two countries, Palau and Australia, have indicated a willingness to host a new US military facility on their soil. Australia, which recently entered an enhanced intelligence and military technology sharing cooperative with the US and UK known as AUKUS, will play host to a growing contingent of US Marines and build several airfields from which US forces could operate in a crisis." No other mentions of Australia in the article. Published on the 4th of December. Headline reads, "The US-led summit a joke on history of democracy, hegemony in essence, according to officials." We'll head into the article to further unpack it. The opening paragraph reads, "The US manipulated so-called Summit for Democracy as a joke, as it is using democracy as a banner to crack down on countries with different systems and development models." A senior Chinese official said on Saturday at a press conference introducing China's whole process, People's Democracy. The remarks were made by Xu Lin, Vice Minister of the Publicity Department of the CPC Central Committee and Director of the State Council Information Office, in response to a question on whether China and the US are combating on the narrative of democracy. Mentions of Australia appear twice, and the paragraph reads, "A recent poll by Pew Research Center on 17 economies, including US allies like the UK and Australia showed that only 17% outside the US see the country as a model for democracy, and the percentage is 19 for Americans themselves. Some 23% outside the US believe the US has never been a model, and 57% says its democracy is decaying. No further mentions of Australia in the article. We'll move along to the next headline, which reads, China not 10 feet tall, but US shorter in the Taiwan Straits. This was published in the Global Times editorial, and we're heading in for a closer look. The opening paragraph reads, when U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin spoke to the Reagan National Defense Forum at the Reagan Library in California on Saturday, he focused on U.S. military policy on China. He noted that recent extensive Chinese military operations in the vicinity of the Taiwan Straits resembled rehearsals of a future attack on Taiwan, and reaffirmed Washington's strong support for Taiwan's ability to defend itself. Australia is mentioned once in the article, and the paragraph reads, many Chinese strategic scholars believe that Austin's and Blinken's tough pronouncements of China will be regular and recurring because they need to encourage allies such as Australia to charge ahead on the tough line against China and leave them no way to retreat, regardless of whether China and the US take actual de-escalation actions to implement the spirit of the virtual meeting between the heads of the two countries in November. Even if the US makes tactical adjustments according to its own pace, it does not want its allies to move the same way, which is why Washington has to maintain the general atmosphere of the China-US confrontation. No further mentions of Australia is found in the article. The next article was published in the column Editor's Picks. Headline reads, Why China Can. A GT exclusive. The West's biggest misconception, cliché about CPC, is that it's not democratic, according to an Italian economist. The editor's note reads, at the remarkable moment in the history of the centennial of the Communist Party of China, the 19th Central Committee of CPC convened the 6th plenary session to comprehensively summarize the major achievements and historical experience of the party's 100 years of endeavors. Additionally, how does the world understand the achievements of the 6 plenary sessions? What is the role that China could play in the future? In the past decades, Giancarlo Elia Valori, an Italian economist and president at the International World Group, has been closely observing the development of China and introduced China's reality and the CPC's policies to the Western world. In a recent interview with the Global Times reporters Shan Jie and Lin Xiaoyi, Valori shared his opinions on issues regarding the CPC's centennial history, China's development, and the Western world's bias against China. The opening question reads, in your opinion, what is the significance of the 6th plenary session and what are the highlights of the resolution? The response by Valori reads, in my opinion, the main points of the resolution can be summarized as the CPC's awareness that has finally emerged from both structural and suprastructural contradictions which accompanied its grandiose century-long struggle to redeem the Chinese people and China as a whole from imperialism, colonialism to neocolonialism. The People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China demonstrate to the peoples trampled on by the superpowers of the past and of the present that it is possible to free oneself from the domination of third parties through the ability to count on one's own strengths despite being a developing and emerging country. In other words, to fight for multipolarity in a world that must not have colonizers and the colonized. We're headed into the mentions of Australia, and it appears as a reaction to the question, you have criticized the US for spreading the China virus theory around the world. Since the outbreak, compared with China's rapid and effective containment of the epidemic, we have seen many other countries, especially self-proclaimed democratic countries, fail in the efforts to fight the epidemic and maintain social stability. What do you think is the reason for this phenomenon, and why is China, whose political system is not favored by the West, able to quickly regain its vitality in a post-epidemic era? So Australia is mentioned in this paragraph, and it reads, the US, Canada, the UK and the European Union took concerted action to announce sanctions against human rights violations of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang region. Furthermore, Australia and New Zealand also issued statements expressing support for sanctions against China by the White House and the European Union. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken stated that, quote, the joint transatlantic operation sends a strong signal to those who violate or trample on international human rights, unquote. And this joint operation is clearly part of an effort made by the US to work with its Western allies against China through diplomatic actions. We move along to the final article, which mentions Australia for the week running from Monday 29th of November to Sunday the 5th of December. 30 articles in all, with mentions of Australia either in the headlines or within the content. This headline reads, The State of Democracy in the United States. Published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the column, Top News. Heading into the article for a closer look. Opening paragraph reads, FM issued a report on US democracy through listing facts, figures, numbers, and opinions of relevant organizations and experts, combing the disadvantages of the US democratic system, analyzing America's chaos of democratic practices and the harm of exporting democracy. Australia is mentioned once in the article, and it reads, in June 2021, Brian Klaas, Associate Professor of Politics at University College London, contributed an article to the Washington Post entitled, The World is Horrified by the Dysfunction of American Diplomacy. The article quotes data from Pew Research Center which suggest that America is no longer a shining city upon a hill, and that most US allies see democracy in the US as a shattered, washed-up has-been. And that 69% of respondents in New Zealand, 65% in Australia, 60% in Canada, and so on, do not think that the US political system works well. More than a quarter of people surveyed in France, Germany, New Zealand, Greece, Belgium, and Sweden believe that American democracy has never been a good example to follow. No further mentions of Australia in this article. And this concludes our look at representations of Australia found within the state media mouthpiece, the Global Times. We'll head over to Sky News Australia next to find out what Australia media is saying about China. The first article I found on Sky News Australia reads on the headline, China could make life very uncomfortable with everybody by joining regional trade pact. This was published in the opinion section of Sky News Australia, and we're heading into the article for a closer look. So Sky News contributor Graham Richardson said China could make life very uncomfortable for everybody if they were to join a regional trade pact. It comes after China applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, which Trade Minister Dan Tehan has described as the gold standard regional trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific. I'm never sure you even want them in the tent. You never know what they're going to do, Mr. Richardson told Sky News host Chris Smith. Unfortunately, under the leadership they've got now, they seem to have gotten more difficult, not less difficult. We'll move along to the next piece. This one is entitled, Nations Need to Change the Way We Behave Towards China. Heading into the article for a closer unpacking. It looks like opening paragraph reads, former White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney says the way China interacts with the US or Australia will not change unless we change the way we behave. First and foremost, that China is not a Western nation, and you cannot treat China the same way you would treat, say, Germany or Argentina. He said that the treatment of China in the Soviet Union was extraordinarily different, and diplomatic relations will not change until the treatment comes first. Until we change the way that we behave towards the Chinese, I don't think we should expect to see the Chinese change the way they behave towards us. Moving along, we have published in the United States section in the Sky News Australia. Headline reads, US to increase presence in Australia, Indo-Pacific to deter potential aggression from China. Opening paragraph reads, bolstering the United States military presence in Australia and across the Indo-Pacific was identified as a priority in a review of the nation's defense strategy as a means of achieving stability in the region in the light of potential conflict with China. The US Department of Defense released the results of its Global Posture Review, which assesses the country's posture in major regions outside of America and what a senior Pentagon official called a robust interagency effort. We'll move along to the next article. Headline reads, Taiwan thanks Australia for its support as China threat looms. Published on the 1st of December, the opening paragraph reads, Taiwan has expressed its gratitude to Australia for standing up to China and contributing to maintaining stability in the region as the Asian superpower represents a growing threat to the safety of the island nation. The country's foreign minister also paid tribute to Australia's history of coming to the aid of its allies in an interview with The Australian. His comments follow a commitment from Defence Minister Peter Dutton to stand up to Chinese bullying after the Global Times editor-in-chief foreshadowed a grim fate for Australia if it were to engage in conflict over Taiwan. Australia is so far from the rest of the world, but look at Australia's record, Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said. Participating in battles or wars in terms of safeguarding freedom and democracy.
Australia's Defence Minister has labelled.
Also in terms of fighting together with allies, it's very touching. We'll move on to the next piece. This was published in the political section and the headline reads, Unnecessary, Inaccurate, McGowan lashes Morrison government over China. This was published on the 1st of December. Western Australia Premier, Mark McGowan has called for caution from the federal government in its rhetoric around China, slamming warnings of war as irresponsible. Defense Minister Peter Dutton warned China was exerting pressure on nations around the world to compel compliance in a recent speech to the National Press Club. It came after he sounded the alarms on a potential conflict between Taiwan and China and said it was inconceivable that Australia would not join the United States if it was dragged into a war. However, Mr. McGowan pointed the finger at the federal government for causing a more difficult relationship with China. The relationship with China is very important. We spent 50 years building a strong relationship with China, and obviously the last 3 years or so have been so much more difficult. Mr. McGowan said during a State of the State address to the Committee of Economic Development Australia on Wednesday. Has it improved? I don't think so. Nationally, it hasn't improved, and we need to put effort into making it more balanced. The Premier also condemned the rhetoric around Australia's relationship with China, calling recent comments necessary. Some of the language nationally, I saw some recently. Once again, the stuff that's going on about war, I don't get it. I don't understand why people in politics talk like that. I think it's necessary. One, it's necessary, and two, it's inaccurate. So there's no point to it, and it's actually quite counterproductive. I just urge anyone engaging in that sort of language to stop being irresponsible. The next piece has to do with tennis, found in the China section. Headline reads, WTA suspends all tournaments in China over concern for Peng Shuai. Heading into the article to unpack it a little bit further. Opening paragraph reads, the Women's Tennis Association has announced it's suspending all tournaments in China due to growing concerns for the welfare of the player Peng Shuai. And the athlete disappeared from public view for 3 weeks after accusing a top Chinese official of sexual assault. The WTA chairman, Steve Simon released a statement saying he could not in good conscience ask players to compete in the country. Unfortunately, the leadership in China has not addressed this very serious issue in any credible way. The next article reads, in its headline, Taiwan warns of further China aggression. Published on the 5th of December, as tensions between China and Taiwan remain tense, a conflict in our region remains possible. Speaking to Sky News Australia, Taiwan's foreign minister says he remains hopeful China will leave his country alone. Published in the Global Affairs section of Sky News Australia, the next headline reads, Taiwan's foreign minister Joseph Wu wants to prevent war with China at all costs. War at all costs must be avoided, but China needs to know that Taiwan is not alone and friendless, writes former Australian Minister for Defence Christopher Pyne. It's hard to pick up a newspaper or click on a news website these days without being offered the opportunity to read something about Taiwan. Taiwan, the small island of 24 million people off the coast of Southeast China, could well be the most dangerous place on the globe in the next few years. Taiwan is a thriving democracy. It became home of the nationalists or the Kuomintang in 1949 when the government of Chiang Kai-shek was defeated by the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. To this day, it has never been governed by the government of the People's Republic of China in Beijing. In fact, it has hardly been governed by China at any time in the last 120 years. It was occupied by Japan from the last 19th century. Technically, it was under the control of Kuomintang in Beijing for just 4 years, from 1944 to 1949, after the defeat of the Japanese and before the end of the Chinese Civil War that had little respite since the 1920s. The government in Beijing insists that Taiwan is part of China and that it must be reunified either voluntarily or, if necessary, by military means. Beijing presumably would then impose a one China, two systems form of government on Taiwan, similar to what was proposed in Hong Kong decades ago. There's just one problem with this proposition. The people of Taiwan don't want reunification. They have a market economy, a genuine democracy that's seen the government change hands peacefully 3 times since 1996, and they control their own territory and have an effective military. Feeling against reunification is so strong, there is even a 51st club that proposes Taiwan should be the 51st state of the United States of America. Unlikely, but it doesn't exactly suggest that the Taiwanese are rushing to embrace rule from Beijing. The overwhelming view of the people of Taiwan is that the status quo should be maintained. In other words, Taiwanese should be allowed to live peacefully without declaring independence and without reunifying with China. China has not tried to conquer the island. In the 1950s, there were shots fired at the islands within reach of the mainland. They are under the control of Taipei. But the Taiwan Strait is a natural buffer protecting Taiwan. The situation is now changed. Modern
Taiwan's
China
foreign minister has
a military capability that must be taken seriously. We move along to the next article. This one was published in the China section, apologies. And the headline reads, Taiwan could become a very convenient scapegoat for China. The opening paragraph, Taiwan may become a very convenient scapegoat for the authoritarian Chinese government's domestic troubles, according to Taiwan's Foreign Minister for Foreign Affairs, Joseph Wu, published on the 5th of December. One thing is very clear, that China is an authoritarian state and it operates under a very different mode of considerations than regular democracies, Mr. Wu told Sky News Australia. China is trying to claim that Taiwan is part of it and has vowed to take Taiwan over through peaceful means if possible, and through forceful means if necessary, and that has been their stance for a long time. If you look at the authoritarianism from a more historical or analytical standpoint, authoritarianism is very often associated with expansionism. And when authoritarianism is facing domestic difficulties, they would like to seek an external crisis or conflict in order to divert domestic attention. The next piece has the headline, Taiwan's foreign minister warns of World War III with China. Published on the 5th of December by Tyrone Clark. Opening paragraph reads, in an exclusive interview with Sky News Australia, Taiwan Foreign Minister Joseph Wu has issued a startling warning of the emerging military crisis with China. Mr. Wu said China's expanding authoritarianism had a very serious impact on the global strategy. Taiwan is on the front line against Chinese expansionism, Mr. Wu told Sky News Australia's Christopher Pine on his weekly program Global Focus. The Chinese government has been exercising its expansionism by using force, and that's something that we need to watch out for very carefully. It caused the Second World War, and we don't hope it will cause the Third World War. If the Chinese government, the authoritarian China, takes over Taiwan, I'm sure it's going to have a very serious impact on global strategy. The Foreign Minister's comments come amid growing concerns from Taiwan's international partners of an increasingly aggressive China, and Chinese war jets crossed Taiwan's air defense zone 159 times in November, which marks the second highest monthly incursions on record. We'll move on to the next article, and this is the final one of the 13 instances of Chinese representation in the news from Sky News Australia. The final piece we'll be looking at has the headline. You can see a huge emphasis on Taiwan for the week. Published on the 5th of December, headline reads, China is more powerful than ever, says Taiwanese minister. China is much more powerful than it was before, according to Taiwan's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Joseph Wu. That is something we need to be very cautious in dealing with China, especially coming to military confrontation. In order to deal with the situation we're facing, a much more powerful adversary these days, We need to do several things at the same time. Mr. Wu said this involved preventing war with China, inviting the Chinese to enter into negotiations, improving military capability, and making allies in the region. And there you go, and there you have it. A comparison of Global Times representations of Australia, as well as Sky News representations of China. And the score this week reads 30 instances coming from the Global Times and 13 instances coming from Sky News Australia. That's all we have for this week. Tune in again in a week's time for a close look at Global Times versus Sky News Australia with the Australia-China Media Watch podcast. Thank you very much indeed.